Welcome everyone to the Bent by Knowledge podcast, where we will dig into what current research and the Bible actually have to say about exercise and good nutrition. All right, welcome back, guys. Here again, I have Dr. Mike Esco and Dr. Mike Fedew. They are researchers at University of Alabama, and I am really excited this time again to talk because we are talking about wearables and trackers. And when I say that, I'm talking about anything that you would wear that is doing things like counting your steps, counting your calorie burn, or a tracker, which is any system where you can record things like your calorie intake, your activity, and all of that stuff. And just about everybody uses some sort of tracker or wearable. And so these guys are the perfect guys to talk about this. And I realized I didn't even get this in the last section. I would love to hear an introduction of both of you and why you are the person to talk about this topic.
You mean your listeners don't just want to trust that we know what we're talking about? You actually want credentials behind this? Yeah, I'll start, and then Esco, you jump in after me, and then we'll kind of go from there. So my name is Mike Fedew. I am a researcher at the University of Alabama. I've been here since 2015. I got my PhD at University of Georgia in body composition and metabolism research. Most of my research at Georgia and from here at UA has been on physical activity interventions, mostly focused on weight loss, adopting healthier lifestyles, cardiovascular disease risk factors. My dissertation was in high-intensity interval training in women, focusing on body composition changes to see if it would work. So I've kind of been hanging out in the body composition world now for about a little bit over a decade. I have an interest in it personally. I've kind of dealt with weight issues for most of my life. So I think I've told Esco and, told a few other people that I think at my highest, I was around 300 pounds and lost a lot of weight through diet and exercise, and wanted to kind of make that, to make that my life. Cause it made a huge difference in me, and just got passionate and just got into it. And before you know it, wound up with a PhD, and now I'm here. So
started from the bottom.
Yeah, there it is. Started from the bottom. Now we're here. Yep.
Yeah, cool. So, I'm Mike Esco. I'm a professor of exercise physiology at the University of Alabama as well. Dr. Fedew and I work closely together, and a lot of our research overlaps, which has been great. Really enjoy working with him. So it's been wonderful. But my background started as I fell in love with weightlifting at a young age. I'm always been thankful for the day I picked up a barbell, for what it did for me, but also how it catapulted an entire career, and I've worked with other, a range of populations, right? Started with a personal trainer, and then kind of as a clinician working with, cardiopulmonary rehab. Also worked as a strength and conditioning coach as well with more, elite athletes. So I've kind of ran I told my students today in class, I've gone through the spectrum of, I think, what you can do with an exercise science degree. And now I look back for the reasons for that was so I can help them kind of get it together and figure out what they want to do with their life, which is really cool. So eventually led to, I got a PhD from Allman University. Where, having the background that I did is more of applied. I was always interested in how we can take what we do in the lab and put it in the hands of practitioners and consumers. So with that, I've studied different methods on how to accurately and conveniently measure parameters of physical fitness. And body composition has been a heavily, driven in that area over the last, well over a decade now. But also, how do we track internal responses to exercise and to physiological strain with a focus on heart rate variability and measuring like heart rate metrics, and wearable technology has been important for both of those sort of endeavors.
Yeah, and I think that's great too, because just like you said, you have a passion with taking things that you would do in a research setting out to the public, and I think wearables are one of the best ways to do that
Oh man,
because
it's wonderful. I mean, this is a
yeah,
great time for us. I read a study recently that we haven't been able to do. Speaking of heart rate variability, we haven't really done a great job with like forming normative data for heart rate variability in that area. And I read a study recently where a group of researchers used Fitbit and measured heart rate variability for 8 million subjects,
oh,
right? So a wearable devices that had and how powerful things, that can be. We're well beyond the lab and doing some really cool research with wearable devices. So it's wonderful.
great. Yeah. Can you take the time really quick to operationally define a wearable, if there is a definition in general?
Yeah, well, actually, so I think,
Something to
operationally
wear.
define a wearable. So I think in a sense, it's any device that you would wear to track any kind of physiological outcome. So I mean, that could be anything. We have watches that can track heart rate. That's a wearable. That can track physical activity. That's a wearable. We've got steps and calories. We have sleep. That's a wearable, right? So anything that you have that's kind of tracking those physiological behavior, responses or behaviors, I think we could kind of broadly define as a wearable. And I think what you're seeing a lot of times too, with these devices that are out, have the capability to track a lot of those different outcomes. And so I think you have these like Esco mentioned, these devices that can measure a lot of different parameters in our field. That opens up a lot of doors for the consumers to kind of learn more about what their body is doing and how it's responding to activity, and to track that. I think it's really valuable.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm really interested in this topic too because, I think people want to get the most bang for their buck, but I think in this case, I mean, sometimes you don't have to spend that much money to get something that does a good job. And so,
Or any money.
right, that's true. That's
The
true.
pedometer that I have is free. It was a free little app and it's accurate.
Yeah,
It's tracking my steps.
checking all your steps.
Hmm.
And just discussing the ones that you use in a research setting that maybe have found their way into normal environments, and anything that is substantiated in the literature. Like I've found that there's a lot of wearables and trackers now that have meandered into research literature, just because I think a lot of researchers like yourselves have probably seen that people generally use the same trackers and wearables, and we have to figure out a way to make data collection easier. And I think that we do have to be able to substantiate those technologies in literature so that other people can use it and it becomes a more convenient tool for researchers in general. So what have you guys seen to be some of the top wearables?
Yeah, so I think, like we kind of mentioned, most of our research has been, at least on my end, has been weight loss, exercise interventions. And so I think on the energy balance equation, we're interested in measuring calories in, so food that's being consumed, kind of dietary intake, and we're also interested in measuring calories out through physical activity. And if we're tracking calories in and tracking calories out, hopefully we can explain why somebody responds the way that they do to an exercise program, building muscle or losing fat. So we've used on our end, we've played around with the Apple Watch. I think the Apple Watch has performed pretty well. I think more than any of the others, I think we've used Fitbit. We've used a few different models of Fitbit to collect data. We've also played around MyFitnessPal for data collection. Esco and I have used there's another device called an Aura ring that we've used to track data. We've tried Garmin. We use Polar Heart Rate monitors. So I think we've tried the Whoop bands also. So I think there are a lot of options out there that can track and track pretty well. And I think for the average user that's out there, they would be well served with any of those devices. We've been pretty happy with the results that they've given.
Yeah, and I know we were talking before this. You mentioned the Aura ring, and I had not even heard about it until I did my research before this podcast. And it's an actual ring that does the same thing as watch devices, right? And so you can
Yeah.
wear it. I mean,
So their I guess their idea was, you take off your band, right? You take off your Apple Watch and you take off your Fitbit. And so their idea was, let's put this into some sort of a wearable device that you don't think about taking off. And so the idea of a ring was, man, that's actually not a bad idea. Like, you don't even think about wearing a ring for the most part. It just kind of stays on forever. And if you're wearing it all the time, you can be tracking all the time. And when Esco and I think we might have had one of the first models that they had, it looked like we were the Green Lantern. Like, the ring, it was a huge ring. But they're onto something. That one was a little bit larger than we would have preferred to wear it, all day long and then sleep in. But it tracked reasonably well. And now I think the newer models are much smaller and kind of less burdensome for the user. And so I think that they're onto it. The Aura Ring, again, it tracked physical activity pretty well. It tracks sedentary behavior pretty well. I think
heart rate.
What's that?
Heart rate.
Heart rate. Yeah, it did a pretty good job.
Yeah. What would be really impressive is if they made the Aura Ring in one of those silicone rings. All the fit people would wear.
Right.
Dude, yeah. I'm trying to tell you. You know what? In a couple of years, the way that the sizes are changing, we will probably have a wearable that is small enough to implant into one of those silicone bands. I guarantee it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And some of the accuracy of some of these devices can be questionable, like for measuring a certain parameter like heart rate or heart rate variability or even tracking steps, but they're getting there. I mean, I have full faith now. I mean, we've created a device that measures body fat percentage from a picture. Who am I to criticize another device? Instead, I mean, I congratulate them for creating these devices, and where areas of inconsistencies or inaccuracies may be, that's an opportunity for the literature, for the research to help improve the processes that underpin, right, the device. So
yeah, and we've been spewing off a whole bunch of metrics, but I would like to get sort of a comprehensive list of the metrics that could be measured with devices like these. Like, what if I were to buy it as a lay person and I'm just looking at it, like I'm a soccer mom, what am I trying to measure in metrics?
Yeah, I think, for the general users, the Fitbits, the Apple Watches, a lot of the wearable devices that track activity, I think we were probably more interested in days per week of physical activity. So how many days you engage in exercise or how many days you meet your target, workout goal. If we're tracking days per week of exercise to kind of align with our physical activity guidelines, being active on most days per week, I think the wearables do a spot on job of tracking that. It can log your workouts. I think if we're tracking total steps, I think for the most part, they do a really good job of tracking total steps. I think they do a pretty good job of tracking moderate to vigorous physical activity. I think they can track sedentary behavior reasonably well also. Those, I think, are going to be the biggest markers that kind of our general population would be interested in monitoring. I think where we may see a little bit more error is when we start trying to estimate energy expenditure or calories burned. That's kind of where we sacrifice a little bit of the accuracy with the wearable devices. But that's
a huge question of mine too, because I always wondered that, because I'm not too deep in this literature, but like I said, I work at Orange Theory and we use heart rate monitors. We have like the EKG version, and then we also have, which I think we'll get into the mechanisms of measurement here in a little bit. But we also have the ones just like the Apple Watch that measure the blood flow. And I'm sitting there thinking, because you do get a measure of calorie burn, and I'm like, how do they get that from heart rate and from body weight, I guess, and sex? And is that accurate? Because I always wonder.
Is it accurate? I think, if you look at the research data, I think where we see the biggest disagreement is when we start looking at the energy expenditure. So we can track steps, and I think the ability for these devices to measure activity level and steps, I think that we're spot on. I think we can do a pretty good job of measuring sedentary behavior and moderate to vigorous activity also. It's just so hard to watch with a wearable device worn on the wrist. It's so hard to watch the movement at the wrist and use that to estimate how much energy a person is burning at that very instant, like how much oxygen the whole body is taking up and using to generate movement,
right.
to complete, for exercise. And so I think You know, in that sense, that is where we see the biggest disagreement. You wouldn't be able to watch the way that my hands move and figure out how many calories I'm burning a lot of times, because I think it just becomes so difficult to estimate what the rest of your body is doing, and you know how hard it is to do it. So I think that's where we see the biggest disagreement. What I would counter with, though, is how accurate do you need it to be? In a sense, right? So we might have a disagreement between actual like energy expenditure, oxygen uptake and how many calories we're burning, what we would get in the lab, and what the Fitbit or what the Apple Watch or what some of these wearable devices are actually giving you. But how accurate do I need it to be for what purposes? So when we say that something is valid, I think that takes on a couple parts. So valid compared to what, and then valid for doing what. If it's valid at measuring energy expenditure in the lab, I think we can do that with a little bit of error. Valid for predicting what and for doing what. Can I generally estimate days that I'm more active and less active based on the calories burned, that my Fitbit or Apple Watch or whatever wearable gives me? Yeah, I think I can do that. I can reasonably see more active days and less active days. And I think that's what we need in a research setting. Like, I can count on a Fitbit or an Apple Watch or a Garmin or an Oura Ring or whatever wearable device to see the difference between days. And I can also count on it pretty reliably to tell me the difference between active people and inactive people. And I think that is what we needed to do as researchers on the whole physical activity spectrum, is to be able to, within a single person, tell differences between days or tell the differences between people, so that I can gauge someone who's more active or less active. Mm-hmm. Right, Esco?
Yeah. To add to that, I mean, I think that's a really important point that he brought up, is like, how accurate do we need it to be? That's a pretty important statement. Like, in our world as researchers, well, it depends on what the research question is. Like, if the primary variable is physical activity or something that these wearables may claim to measure, then we need to really have a criterion device to gauge that. We need to be really concerned with accuracy because we're doing research. But if I'm working with a client who this wearable device is motivating them to really pay attention to what they're consuming or how active they truly are, and helping them live a healthier life, doesn't really truly matter if it's precise enough to live in a laboratory. It's helping that individual become more physically active. And that's really another exciting thing to all this. Really, the most important thing for all of it are the end users.
Yeah, I definitely agree there too. And I also like thinking about some of the other things. Like at FSU, I worked with some more elite athletes and some more fit folks. And we had trackers that measured things like sleep quality, sleep latency, all of these things. And then, like you mentioned it, Esco, before, heart rate variability and all that stuff. So I know that many people probably don't know what heart rate variability is. So can you define that a little bit?
Sure, yeah. So heart rate variability. So we have heart rate. Heart rate is beats per minute. But what heart rate variability is the variation in time between each beat, right? So we think that heart rate is more metronomic, and it's not. When we really analyze it at the minute level, there's quite a bit of variability between each beat. So when we have a heartbeat and then a next heartbeat that occurs after that, there's a time gap between those two heartbeats. The next pair of heartbeats, there's another time gap. And the next pair of heartbeats, there's another time gap, and so forth, so on and so forth. And the time between each of those intervals, and if we were to measure that across a whole strip or whatnot, we'll see a certain variability or a certain pattern variation between those heart rate intervals. And that's what heart rate variability is. And what we want is we want a high heart rate variability when we're at rest. So we want to be able to, like, when you breathe in deeply, your heart rate will tend to, speed up. And then when you exhale and you do that slowly, it'll slow down, right? And there's some physiological reasons for that. And it's really a cool area to study, but it's a measure of the autonomic nervous system. right? So if a high heart rate variability is indicative of a rest and digest, the parasympathetic nervous system, and a low heart rate variability is more indicative of like sympathetic overdrive. So if we're in a stressed out state, heart rate variability would be low. And if we're in a restful state or we're well recovered, heart rate variability is high. So we measure heart rate variability in our athletes every day to kind of get an idea of their internal recovery, because heart rate variability is related to how one may perform on a given day. If the heart rate variability is high when they wake up in the morning, that means they're well rested, well recovered, and usually they can perform well under that state. But if their heart rate variability is low, they may not have slept well, they're stressed out, some other stressor could affect that.
Interesting. Yeah. So basically, the more variable the heart rate is, the more they're able to adapt. Or
exactly. Yeah, right. So it's a marker of adaptation as well. Yeah. So, usually like at the beginning of the season, athlete starts competing. They, their competition picks up. Their heart rate variability is going to kind of change based upon how adapted they are and how well prepared they are for a season, right? Or for competition. We've seen athletes who would have an event coming up on a given day, and we measure their heart rate variability leading up to that, and their pattern throughout that week is predictive of how they perform in that competition, which is really cool. So we can kind of get an idea of how they're going to perform going into it. Heart rate variability also is useful for being an early detector of how well somebody will respond to an exercise program. So if their heart rate variability changes, it goes up from 1 week to another week on average, and they're on a given exercise program, usually that means that they're responding favorably to that program. If it goes down, and they're on a given program, then it may not be the best program for them. There are other factors that play into that, but just kind of some general areas that we're venturing in with the research, which is really neat. So it's a method of like periodization.
The regular watch that I would buy is able to measure that, or you're saying this is like a fancy watch?
So there are kind of more popular watches, wearables that are starting to introduce heart rate variability. What we've done in our lab over the past few years, usually or traditionally, to measure heart rate variability required a 5-minute recording procedure, which is just not practical for measuring, especially like athletes. So what we've done is we've discovered ways in which we can do it in ultra short recordings of just 1 minute. So all that's really required is a 1 minute stabilization period and a 1 minute recording period. So we can get an accurate measure of heart rate variability in just 2 minutes. There's a multitude of parameters of heart rate variability. I call heart rate variability the simplest, most complex metric around, because there's a lot of complexities centered around this very simple concept, but a lot of it's how we actually measure it. But we use a statistic called the root mean square of the successive differences of R-to-R intervals, RMSSD, which is a marker of parasympathetic control. And we can get that in 2 minutes. And what we've also discovered is there are some accurate smartphone applications on the market that really measure heart rate variability. What they're measuring is pulse rate variability from the fingertip. There's one called HRV for training, which we use a lot in research, that uses the camera sensor, where you put your finger over the camera and you put the little indicator of go, and it will give a recording of a minute. And there's another one that we use. It's accurate as well, called iThlete, like athlete, but with an I. And it's a finger sensor as well. And that's been very convenient for our monitoring our athletes and our subjects.
That's taking me back to my my master's EKG class day. Is that called sinus arrhythmia when you have that variability? I think that's what.
Yes.
Yes, right. Yeah, it is. Yep.
That was like 6 years ago.
Nailed it.
That relates to It's a sinus arrhythmia. Yep, absolutely.
You
Oh
you
my
asked
God.
Esco an HRV question, and he just nerded out. That was so
Oh, look at him
fantastic. I was
go.
so
Look.
excited to watch that.
Yes,
I
man.
was all wide-eyed too, like, okay.
It's such a fascinating topic. You know, I
It
I
mean,
love
is.
it.
it's a simple metric. Heart
Yeah,
rate
easy
is a
to
very easy
measure.
measure to get, but it's
Yeah,
indicative of the autonomic nervous system.
pretty
So,
cool.
yeah.
I'm also interested in the mechanisms in how these wearables measure things. So I would like to talk about mechanisms in how they measure heart rate, because I know there are a few, like I said, the EKG, and then I always forget what it's called, something plethysmography or something like that.
Photoplethysmography.
Yes, that one. And also mechanisms in how they measure like steps, because I know Fedew, you mentioned being on the wrist, sometimes it's difficult. And I know we've seen movies where it's like the boss gives her intern her watch, and her intern's like running around trying to get her steps for her because her trainer's going to yell at her or something like that.
Yep.
So it's effective. But I would like to talk about the mechanisms specifically with how it reads heart rate, how it reads steps, and then any other things that you think would be important to talk about.
Yeah, so the devices to track activity, they use something called vector magnitude in the accelerometers. So what we're actually measuring within the device is something, we call them VMs. So we're measuring the force that's being produced in a given direction. And so traditionally, like I think a lot of the accelerometers, the wearables use a triaxial accelerometer. So those are measuring force in 3 different planes. So, if you move your arm around, we can tell kind of which plane the movement was performed in and then how hard you swung your arm. And so when we watch kind of the changes in vector magnitudes, or as they're being recorded, we can record the activity over a certain time period called an epoch. And so we can watch, over a 24-hour period, we can break those epochs down into seconds. We can break them down into like each individual second. We can break them down into 60-minute or 60-second epochs. And so we can watch activity, how much force you're producing in a certain direction over a given time period. And so from that, we can figure out activity level. We kind of know what a minimum vector magnitude is, or to quantify as a step. So we can figure out steps that way. We can also use that to kind of categorize other things like moderate to vigorous activity. We use that if we see a string of zeros, like when we actually break down the data that the wearable is collecting. Strings of zeros usually indicate sedentary behavior. So if we're not seeing any movement in any direction at the wrist, we probably think that the person is sitting. And if we see, too many of those zeros over a long period of time, we know that you probably took the device off. So we would code that as non-wear time, or as, as sleep time. And so I think, if you think of that actually, it helps you understand the potential error that you could be, seeing with the device. So we know, like, if you wore 4 different trackers on the same wrist on the same day for the same amount of time, each second is being time stamped. At the end of your day, each one of those 4 trackers is probably going to give you a different step count, right? I mean, just by a little bit, not by a lot. Each one of them is probably recording in just a little bit different way, with a little bit different algorithm, with a little bit different, way of quantifying movement. And I think that that's okay. They'll be reasonably accurate, and all their numbers will be pretty similar, but there will be a little bit of error. We've actually worn multiple devices around the lab just to see what we were getting, because again, we're just watching force in a certain direction and trying to equate that to a step. But since it's worn on the hands, we can't actually see movement within the lower body, so we're a little bit limited. I think in that sense they do a pretty good job too.
Yeah, for sure. I know it is interesting to think about too, because we have some studies going on with pregnancy where we actually put the Actical around the ankle. And I'm like, I don't know what the rationale for that was, but like deciding whether you're going to put it on the ankle or the wrist. But I mean, I can imagine in a practical setting, it's not going to really matter, like we talked about before, like how much you actually care about the precision or all of that stuff. Like, are you
I
getting a
think
step count at the end of the day?
reliability is important. Making sure you're keeping it on the. If you're using it on the ankle, keep it on the ankle. If you're using it on the wrist, keep it on the wrist. Be consistent. I think that's important from a practical perspective.
Yeah, for sure. Interesting. So mechanisms of movement and activity. Now, what about heart rate? How do these devices measure heart rate?
Yeah, so heart rate, there are heart rate like chest worn straps. You know, the earlier or first versions of heart rate monitors were, you know, a strap, and then the information from the strap was transmitted to a watch, so that the data was not collected actually by the watch. It was read by the watch, but it was collected by the strap, and that was like a somewhat like an electrode from an electrocardiogram. You know, it would pick up heart rate and heart rate variability from that. But now, you know, the advancement in technology has brought wrist-worn watches, and what the watches are detecting are the pulse that is transmitted from the you know, the vasculature underneath it. And same way with like the Oura Ring or these, you know, the devices that are worn on the fingers. And then of course there are pulse, you know, pulse rate detection methods where, you know, the fingertip is placed on, like I said, the camera phone or some other pulse, but or some other device. But the further away you get from the heart, the less accurate it may become, especially under stressful conditions. So at rest, you know, most of these devices are pretty accurate. The inaccuracies really become a concern if they're trying to gauge exercise heart rate. That's more difficult to do because the vasculature network changes quite a bit to meet the physiological demands of exercise compared to rest. And that's where we are concerned oftentimes of using some of these, especially wrist-worn devices or the fingertip or whatnot, because we haven't really seen that they are indeed, you know, as accurate as we would like for them to be in measuring exercise heart rate.
Yeah, and I
Really just depends on what you're trying to do.
yeah, and I'll say I've seen that too. So to recap what you're saying, to measure heart rate, typically you either measure the electrical activity of your heart or you measure your blood flow or the color of your blood moving through. And the further away from your heart, especially in an exercise setting, it becomes a bit more difficult to measure. And I'll say in Orange Theory, I remember back in the day, I've been a coach for 6 years, but back in the day, we only had chest leads. We only used the EKG heart rate monitors. And then they got a little crazy and fancy and they started developing the wrist ones or the arm ones. And I noticed in doing things like rowing where your muscles are tensing up when you're rowing, like the muscles that
I said yes. Yeah, I was agreeing with you.
Yeah, so it impedes blood flow, and so it makes it more difficult for the heart rate monitor to pick up your blood when you're tensing up those muscles. And so we have to encourage the members to really loosen up in their grip and all that stuff, because it'll show that they're in the lowest heart rate zone when they're really pushing hard and near death.
Yeah.
So
and depending on what the device is too, it could also pick up electrical myography, right? So the electrical activity of a skeletal muscle that's, you know, underneath it. So there's a lot of artifact that can play into that.
Yeah, that actually made me think too, because when we only had those EKG leads, it was difficult for pregnant women. They would have to move it actually above their chest.
Right, yeah.
Because it could sometimes pick up on the baby or not hit it at all. Yeah. So they were limited.
Yeah, it's really hard to measure a person's heart rate or, you know, any physiological response when they're carrying another person inside of them.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. So wearable and tracker tools and research are likely different than the ones that we would use every day in some situations. Can you talk about some of the wearables and trackers that are most substantiated in the research, or the ones that you mostly use in your research setting?
Yeah, so actually, I think that we've already mentioned one of them. I think the wearable that we have probably the most substantial body of evidence supporting is a Fitbit, and I think part of that, you know, is just because it's been around for the longest. I think the other wearables are probably not far behind that. ACSM identified the wearable tech is one of the hottest fitness trends for, you know, over the past couple of years, and so I think probably similar to the discussion we had about body mass index, it's used a lot because it's been around for the longest. And so, if somebody in the research world is trying to figure out like which one of these commercial grade wearables is valid and could be used in research, there's probably more data supporting that because it's been around longer than the other ones. But where you start again kind of getting into the weeds a little bit is you start trying to find the validity data to support a specific model or a specific brand or a specific software version. With the app that we mentioned, like we mentioned the specific version of the software that showed up in the validation paper that we had, and we're like 3 versions from that now. I think the same thing happens with Fitbit is like, the stuff that we have, the research data supporting from start to finish, you can probably tell the listeners how long it takes to get a study brainstormed through IRB, your data collected, everything analyzed, published, and out to press. It takes a while. And so by the time that paper is published showing the validity for version 2 of the software, we're probably at version like 5 or 6 that the consumers have access to. And we're just a little bit slow on the research side of things to catch up, and we'll get there eventually. Research just tends to move a little bit slower, and I think the general population has access to the newer stuff faster than we do sometimes.
Yes. I mean, research crawls. That's so funny.
So slow. And I think, if you think about it, at that point, the validity, if you've established version 2 is somewhat accurate, and we're on like version 5 or 6, at that point, I think the validity comes, somewhat irrelevant. Right? Like at that point, we know that the older versions worked. We're kind of assuming that versions 5 or 6 are at least as accurate. We can't find any validity data supporting it. It's probably good enough. And so that's kind of where we are, I guess. We're just sacrificing maybe a little bit of accuracy potentially for the, for the added benefit of being able to track and monitor remotely. Right, the added access, the consumers want it. It's a lot less cumbersome than some of the research grade devices. So I think that's probably where we are. The research just can't keep up.
Yeah, no, I agree there. So speaking of that, are there any trackables or wearables that are in the streets, so to speak, that are slowly making their way into a research setting? Because I know in my experience, at least in the sports nutrition world, oftentimes it's the fact that, bodybuilders have been doing this one crazy thing with nutrition or diet, and researchers are just realizing it and now trying to pull it out of the streets and do research on it. So is there anything that's coming up into the lab setting that you can talk about?
Yeah. So, bar velocity has been a really cool topic, and that was born in the fitness in the gym, and we are using bar velocity in the lab, and that's not a wearable on a person. Usually there are devices that can be worn on a person to really measure bar velocity, but usually that's a wearable on the actual bar where you track the velocity of a bar, so you leave weight kind of consistent, and the speed of the bar is related to a person's ability to perform on that given day. So, that's one example. And that's really, really a cool area too. And, one that we're excited to use in our lab to gauge recovery, because we don't want to do repeat 1 RMs, because that in itself is pretty damaging. A person has to recover from that, but we're trying to gauge their recovery on a daily basis. We need something else. So we use bar velocity oftentimes for that. That's one that I can think of.
Oh, one that we've seen pop up in kind of the general population first, that I guess we're trying to keep up with, the Whoop band has been like really popular. I think a lot of athletes have been wearing it. I think that has been one that kind of just blasted into the mainstream, that I guarantee you right now, if you went to PubMed and tried to search for validation research about the Whoop band, you're going to come up with a lot of stuff about whooping cough. Like we actually had some students try to do that in one of the classes that I teach, measurement and evaluation. We had them actually go out and try to find like validation studies about some of the tech that's out there. And so this was, I guess, about a year ago, but the only validation research that was out about the Whoop band was was a dissertation study that was published in ProQuest, and all the students came back and they were like, wait a second, what are you talking about? We have all these baseball athletes that are wearing the Whoop band and they're tracking all this stuff. What do you mean there's no validation research behind it at that time? There's a couple now, but I think we're just, again, so slow to respond. And I think if from a company perspective, if it's out there, the research at that point can just catch up, right? So it can be released to the masses, and athletes can track and monitor, and the research can kind of get with the program a little bit and catch up to where the general public actually is. But I think the Whoop is probably the one that I've seen maybe the biggest disconnect between the popularity and the research behind it.
What's so special about this Whoop watch?
I mean, it can actually track a lot of stuff. So I think it measures, I think one of the things is it measures sleep. I think that's a huge performance. It can, it's supposed to be able to track recovery. I think in that aspect, it's geared more towards the more athletic population. Cause I think, a lot of, if you think Fitbit and some of the other wearables, I think they're more geared toward the general population. I think Whoop is a little bit more specific than that. So, and athletes they're wild. And if there's something that somebody promises can improve their performance, then they will probably go out and do that with no questions asked. And so, so I think that again has kind of led to the popularity, almost like this cult following.
In heart rate and heart rate variability are foundational within the Whoop and, similar devices too. And those are pretty hot topics now that are emerging in the research, but, it's like many of these companies like Polar, there's a lot of validation papers on different Polar devices, but not one paper will you find specific Polar algorithms within there. So companies do their own research, and that's where, they have their own lab, and the research that they're doing is not for publication purposes, but is to better their device, which is perfectly fine. Right. And then these companies market their product and they get the right models or whatnot that are using the product, and it increases the popularity. People don't really understand truly how research even fits into that.
No.
But the consumer's not dumb either. And so I think like with the Whoop, right, if it says that it's tracking your sleep and your sleep quality and your stress and, your physiological strain and heart rate variability, if it says that it's tracking all of that and it's giving you garbage back, people are not dumb and they'll recognize that it's not helping their performance. And so I think that they've created a product that I think does well and tracks well, and I think the users love it, and I think the interface is really slick, and I think, again, as researchers, we need to speed up.
Yeah,
but I think it's there, and I think if the product wasn't delivering what it claimed to, and I think the users weren't happy, then it wouldn't be as popular as it is.
So cool. Yeah. Speaking of speeding up research, I did see some crazy wearables. Like we were talking about, I saw a contact lens. I saw a belt. Are there other crazy ones that you guys have seen on the market?
Their facial scanners are getting some steam as well, to where they can measure actually heart rate and heart rate variability, and
from a facial scan.
From a facial scan, and from an optical scan as well, from blood that's pulsating through these different, anatomical landmarks, right? I mean, it's really cool, and it gets to where, like, we're physiologists. That's what we do. Like, we don't know how to create a product, but we know how to study physiology. But my friends over in mechanical engineering department and computer engineering department or whatnot, they know how to create the technology. So, where physiology and engineering come together, which is really just such a cool area of collaboration. And I think going forward now, we're going to see more specific degrees in academic programs that are developed that relate to not only product development, but the physiology and the understanding of what's behind it.
Yeah, so important, I think. And I mean, I think about how cool some of that stuff would be in field work where all those measurements would be difficult. Like, I have friends that do research at USAREUM, the United States Army Research Institute, in
Mm-hmm.
Massachusetts, and to like put a contact lens in and to measure all of those
Oh my
things,
goodness, yeah.
crazy utility.
Unobtrusive. That's what they're after. The military is after unobtrusive methods of determining like readiness, and wearable devices assist with that. They have a tactical purpose for it.
Yeah. Any other crazy ones that you guys have seen?
There was one that was around a couple of years ago. It was called the Misfit Ray, and there was another like Fitbit version, tracked activity. It did sleep, it did activity, or steps and things like that. But I think that one was a really unique one. They marketed it toward more female wear users. It was a watch, like wristband, but then you could also take it off and it could be plopped into a necklace charm, which I thought was pretty slick.
Oh.
I think I can't remember if there were earrings that went along with it also, but it was like, okay, cool, right? Again, kind of the same approach that the Aura took. Like if you're going to put it in a ring so that you kind of forget that you're wearing it, you're more likely to wear it and track consistently. And so I think they were spot on with that. If you put it into jewelry and it doesn't look like this big wearable like Apple Watch, that isn't necessarily appropriate or sleek for all occasions. I think that one device, you could dress it up. It came in like rose gold. There were a couple other accessories you could throw with it. So I think that there are some crazy ones, but to Esco's point too, I think the field is wide open, and I think with all this data, I think it becomes essential for us as as researchers and practitioners to know what to do with the data once it's collected, because it all has to be done for a purpose. Like measuring just to measure doesn't serve anyone. It has to be measured. It has to be measuring to improve performance, to track readiness, to improve adaptations and things like that. So when you measure something like sleep quality or HRV or physical activity or strain or whatever you want to call it, recovery, it actually has to correlate to performance, or it actually has to correlate to something that the athlete or your client or participant is doing. It has to be linked with some sort of tangible outcome. And so I think in that sense, these algorithms, they can serve a purpose, but only if they're predicting what you're trying to do accurately. Like, what's the point of tracking sleep recovery or sleep or recovery status if you can't link it to anything?
Yeah.
What does it matter?
I mean, no grant agency is going to care.
Bingo.
I mean, that's the thing. There's the research side of it, and that's going to be, bring its whole set of concerns. And then there's the practical side of it. I mean, if most of my clients that I've worked with, they already know if they sleep well or not, right? But to actually quantify that, it provides very important information to where we really get more specific to, I already know. That's like body composition. Most people I've worked with, I already know I'm fat. I don't need to measure that, but let's quantify that. Let's get a better, understanding of what it is that your body is made of. And these wearables allow us to understand more about their lifestyle, their sleep patterns, and valuable information is provided with us.
That's great. Yeah, we talked a lot about trackers, we talked a lot about wearables, not too much about trackers. And I wanted to really just briefly touch on some of the trackers, and the one that came to mind was just MyFitnessPal, right? Trackers are things that you can physically plug into an application or a website, and they can track anything for you. And I think most people are interested probably in the calorie intake and what I'm eating in my diet. But can you talk about maybe some things that you would measure with trackers, or what people are interested in using them for?
Yeah, so I'll talk about MyFitnessPal, I guess, because that's the one that I've kind of had the most experience with on the research side of things. And I think that's been the one that has kind of crossed over into the research setting more consistently. To measure dietary intake. And just as a complete disclaimer, not a registered dietitian. So speaking as an exercise physiologist who needed something to track calories in and needed something to track energy intake and calories, without putting a tremendous burden on their participants. So, we really needed something that was inexpensive and could be relatively accurate and give us reasonable data. And I think if you're looking for something inexpensive and reasonably accurate that has a pretty good interface for the users, I think MyFitnessPal does that. I think it can be used. I think there's a couple limitations that we've seen with some of the dietary, food trackers. And I think they're pretty consistent with a lot of them, and the same limitations in a sense that we see with just regular food logs in a research setting. If somebody doesn't report it and doesn't log it, then it can't be tracked. And so one of the biggest benefits, I guess, of MyFitnessPal, it does correlate pretty strongly with kind of our normal like food logs and dietary records. The correlation, I think, is pretty good. I think it does have a tendency to underestimate. And I think one of the major reasons that it tends to underestimate by a little bit is because foods are in some cases difficult to find. And so I think there's a review paper that came out a couple of years ago that estimated probably we're going to underestimate by about 400 or 500 calories per day. And, that's not a lot. And if you think in the grand scheme of things, being off by 400 or 500 calories, that's pretty reasonable accuracy. But if we're trying to find a food to log it and it's not there, that can become really frustrating. And some of the data that they presented said that, about 20% of the foods, were just left off of MyFitnessPal because they were hard to find. And I think, if you extrapolate that on our side of things, if we're focusing on weight loss and we think that a pound of fat has about 3,500 calories, underestimating by 500 calories a day over 7 days, that's your entire 3,500 calories right there. And so I think that can have kind of a big impact on us if we're focusing on weight loss. But I think, as the algorithms improve, I think as the longer that they're around, I think the more foods that are added to databases, their databases, I think that the accuracy will improve. I think the big key for a lot of them is making the user experience as easy as possible. Yeah. One of the things we did with some research in our lab, we tracked, weight loss and dietary intake over a 6-week study. And what we found is every week from baseline, all of our participants' like calorie intake dropped. And so they were restricting calories based on their food logs. And we were like, oh my gosh, this is crazy. We should see these like crazy changes in body composition and weight loss at the end of the study. But we didn't, because they weren't eating less. They just didn't want to track it because it was taking so long to log all the foods. And so their food kept going down and down and down every week. And they were eating fewer and fewer calories, it looked like, on the logs, but they weren't actually.
Yeah, there's a lot of user fatigue. Actually, we talk about that.
It is.
We talk about that in our center too, because I mean, you have them doing a 3-day food log and a 7-day exercise log, and I mean, they get a little lazy, and I'm like, I get it. Like, I don't think I would want to do it either.
Log it, track it. I mean, and the food logs they're complicated. They're I've learned so much from tracking those dietary records of drinks that you've had, and like whether it had ice in it, about how big the glass was, like if you had something to eat, were there condiments on it, like about how big portion sizes were. So it's incredibly difficult to estimate quantity and portion size and remember all of those extra toppings and condiments and things that can be added to foods and drinks. And so tracking those calories, in a big sense, if you're only off by 500 at the end of the day, that's a pretty good job. But that 500 calories can be really important too if you're trying to focus on weight loss.
There are picture apps too, right? Where you can take a picture of your food and store it.
Yeah, there are some. I haven't used any of them personally in research, but I have seen a few of them out. They can take pictures of, you take a picture of your plate before you eat it, and it can kind of recognize foods and log them, so you don't need to track it on your own. On just personally from the research side of things, I haven't seen as much validity data yet behind those because I think they're relatively new, kind of the image recognition. But I think there's promise there. If we can get more evidence kind of supporting those different approaches to tracking food, I think you can reduce some of the participant burden of having to log all that stuff. And so I think that's really promising if we can get there, for sure.
It'd be interesting if they'd be able to tell what was in my one pot wonder crock pot meals.
Good luck with casseroles, right?
Yeah. Well, last question, and this is mostly for people that are just interested in what the best is, and I feel like I already know what you're going to say, but if you were to buy one wearable, let's say, okay, you had to buy it for your wife. Okay, we'll throw her in there. What would you buy today for her?
A beautiful dress.
A beautiful dress. What is a dress going to track?
No, well, that's what she can wear. She looks pretty and beautiful.
No.
Wow, for my wife. Well, I mean, I don't know. Um, I would really like for her to collect heart rate variability. So,
You're such a nerd.
Researcher.
but in general, though, I mean, for general population, I would say something to track your steps. You know, if it's a pedometer or an actual physical activity tracker, tracking your physical activity is incredibly important because at the end of the day, that's what we're trying to create. We're not really trying to create exercisers necessarily. We're trying to create more physically active people.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, a calorie doesn't really care if it's burned from gardening or walking around the block or lifting weights, right? So I think that in general is what's most important to me.
And do you have a specific brand you might get her? Not the dress, the watch.
Actually, I don't. I mean, it would, you know, her personally, I don't think she's going to wear anything that's not, you know, once these wearables actually realize that style is important, you know, then I think that's really missing link with a lot of these, because
that's what Apple Watch did well. Now they have all those cool.
Now they're getting a lot better, right?
Yeah.
So I guess it would be something like that.
What about you, Fedew?
You know, actually, so you hit it actually just spot on. You need to wear it. And so like I'll confess, I have two Fitbits I have two Fitbits. I'm not currently wearing any of them. I also have an Apple Watch and I'm not currently wearing it either. If you're not wearing it, you can't track with it. And I think that becomes the issue, is that you need to figure out how to have the person actually wear the device to monitor consistently. And then actually it serves the purpose that you want it to do. If that's the case on my end, like all that I really need this fitness tracker to do is track my activity. And my favorite one that I've ever had was actually the Fitbit Flex. It was the old school one. I think it's their cheapest one maybe. And all it showed was like 5 little dots for 10. You get 1 dot per 2,000 steps. And eventually at the end of the day, if all your dots light up, you hit your goal of 10,000. Like that was kind of how it worked. It didn't have a ton of interface. I don't even think it had a screen on it. It was literally just dots. We've used it in research. Like I liked it a lot. It linked with their app. I thought that was pretty slick too. If you really wanted to know how many steps that you took and actually like count every single one to know exactly where you're at for the day, I thought that was really good. And that was really all that I needed it for. But I think you did hit on something. I think that it has to look good. And I think a lot of the wearables, at least the older versions, they looked like they were fitness wearables. And they had like the weird kind of armband that looked like it was a sporty, sweat resistant kind of deal. And it just didn't look like I can't wear this with a suit or with a tie or with a dress or something like that. So I think Esco hit it. I mean, I think it has to look like something you would normally wear. Otherwise people won't wear it. And then it defeats the entire purpose of having a wearable in the first place.
I bought a $8 watch recently from a retail store or whatnot, and I was wearing it. Fedew said, "Man, is that a new wearable? That's cool. Is that the new?" Like, no, it's an $8 watch.
He was flashing it on a Zoom, and I was like, "Dude, did you get is that a new fit? Yeah. What is that?" And he was like, "Actually, this is actually called a watch, and all it does is track time." Yeah. And I forgot that sometimes you don't have to have a fit. That was important. But I think stuff that I really like. I like the Nike Run Club app. I've actually really liked to. I've used that works with the Apple Watch. I thought that was really slick. It does a pretty good job of tracking time and distance and activity. And so I think in that sense that's what I currently use to track my workouts. But I think the favorite one that I've ever had was that inexpensive kind of older model, the Fitbit Flex. It's kind of funny. It's got a special spot in my heart.
Yeah. Always be there.
It always will. Yeah. And like we've, on a research side of things too, we used it for research. It did really well. We handed them out to participants as an incentive to be in a study. And then we monitored kind of remotely. We could track their activity level using that. And I think, they did really well for that too. We were super happy, and it didn't cost an arm and a leg to get all of our participants a wearable. So we were super stoked.
That's awesome. Well, do you guys have any more words of wisdom in the tracker wearable department?
Yeah, I think for a lot of folks out there, it's January. I think there's New Year's resolutions. If you're not tracking, you can't see progress. And so I think that is, whether you're tracking with a Fitbit or an Apple Watch or a Garmin or a Polar, or, you know, whatever brand you're using, make sure that you're going to actually use it and track, and that you're using it consistently, because there's no way to gauge how far you've come and the progress that you made unless you know where you started. And so I think, you know, regardless, we always tell our students, like, just the act of recording your activity level is probably enough to bump it up by about 10%. And so just having that, you know, having that wearable to track how much moving you're doing is enough to get you active sometimes, to provide that extra bump and that motivation. So get one, track it, and use it, and use it for what it's supposed to be.
Love it. Well, I thank you guys so much again for being on this second of the 3-part series. And next time we're going to be talking about one of my favorite topics, because I have way too many opinions, which is how to be a better nutrition and exercise professional. And I think in the fitness world and in the research world, we can be plagued with certain issues and just ways to be a better professional. And so I am so excited to be able to talk about that. And again, thanks so much, Dr. Fedew and Dr. Esco. Look forward to talking to you next time.
Let's do it. Thanks for having us.
Thank you very much.
Hey guys, I am so excited for my new book entitled Through His Strength by Improving Ours, Family, to be released on February 4th. This book has been strategically designed to educate parents and caretakers on what the Bible and research have to say about exercise and nutrition. And then after they soak in all that good information, they will rally the family troops and complete discussion questions and fun practical application activities. To learn more about my new book, visit my website at www.drbrittanyRallman.com. That's www.drbrittanyRallman.com.